Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Bridging Gender Data Gap and Connecting Data Communities. This is the fourth webinar of the series Beyond the Numbers, Harnessing Data for SDGs, a joint initiative by Open Data Watch, Paris 21, and CEPE. Thanks very much for joining us today. If you participated in the previous webinar, welcome back. And if you are just tuning in, we are glad to have you with us. My name is Sheda Badi, and I'm the Managing Director of Open Data Watch, and I'll be your moderator for today. Our organization is an international NGO working at the intersection of open data and official statistics. We aim to improve the use, quality, and availability of official statistics for the measuring and achieving of the SDGs. Today's webinar discusses the intersection of gender equality and development data and focuses on initiatives underway that aim to close gender data gaps and what is needed to bridge different actors within the gender equality space, including, of course, academics, international organizations, policymakers, and civil society organizations. We have a great hour organized ahead of us for you, and we will dive soon into the discussions with our three expert guest speakers. We will then hear from you, our audience, with some questions and for the panelists, and we will gauge your perception on the topic with a few interactive polls. So get ready for an exciting hour ahead of us. Before we start, though, I'm going to turn to Deirdre, our webinar manager, Deirdre Appel, who is the program manager at Open Data Watch, who will take us through the logistics for the hour ahead. Over to you, Deirdre.
Thanks, Sheda, and welcome again to everyone who has joined us for the fourth webinar. A few short housekeeping points to share before we get started. First off, this webinar is being recorded, and the link and video will be shared after the conclusion of the webinar. It will be made available on the webinar partners' websites, which are Open Data Watch, CEPE, and Paris 21. So please feel free to share this webinar link for those and colleagues who might not be with us here today. Second, on the right-hand side of your webinar screen, you should see a tab on your drop-down menu or your control panel called Questions. As we move through the webinar and you hear the three presentations from our speakers, please add in any questions you might have about the topics here. We will revisit them during the Q&A and select a few to pose back to our speakers in the second half of the webinar. On this menu, you will also see a tab called Handouts. Our speakers have prepared a few slides and graphics to support their presentations, and though you will be seeing them on the screen as they go through their presentations, we've added them here for your own viewing or to download for future reference. Another point is that we do have an email for the webinar series. It is beyondthenumbers@gmail.com. If there are any other questions or if you want to reach out for additional information after the webinar, please feel free to send us an email there, as we look forward to staying engaged with our audience on the topic after the webinar. So the last thing to note is that we are aiming to make this webinar as interactive as a virtual presentation can be. We'll do this through an interactive polling segment after the speakers' presentations, where we'll pose questions to you to get your feedback and perspectives, as also field some questions from the questions box later. I'd also like to encourage everyone online to use the questions box feature to introduce yourself, perhaps adding what organization you are from, where in the world you might be dialing in from, and why gender data is important to you. Please feel free to do this now, and we can get a feel for who's online with us today, in addition to the faces that you're seeing here on the screen. So that is it for me for now. Thank you again for joining, and I will hand it back to Sheda, who will take us through the next portion of the webinar with our speakers.
Thanks, Deirdre. Based on the attendance that we have, which is really very welcoming and very nice, over 80 people we see online, I think we all agree that gender disaggregated data is tremendously important, and we need to invest in collecting and analyzing this data and sort of adding value to it. And particularly for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. We also realize that a broad range of actors need to work together to identify what the needs are, what are the gaps, create new methodologies, and provide proper disaggregation, establish new data sources, and sort of work together on disseminating and making this data usable and used. This month, the month has been very rich in this area of gender data. There's been lots of discussions around the 58th UN Statistical Commission in New York, and then shortly after that was followed by the Commission on the Status of Women, which is really a major gathering of gender equality experts and advocates. And the conclusions of these important events provides a great opportunity to discuss the intersection between development data and gender communities, and also how partnership can benefit both. One thing I think we all appreciate and has come out from these discussions is that the task of to bridge the data gaps in gender and connecting community is not an easy one. Luckily, we have today we have 3 terrific professionals working in this space to offer their own unique view of progress towards closing gaps and share their own collaborations, the collaborations that have cultivated success, and discuss the roadblocks that they have seen in impeding their progress. Our first speaker, I'm really excited, is Eleanor Carey. She's the technical manager at Data2X. She will share new findings from a recently released report entitled Bridging the Gap, Mapping Gender Data Availability in Africa, and focus on the actionable solutions that governments, policymakers, and civil society can implement to prevent gender data inequalities. After that, we have Thando Malambo, Program Officer of the Center of Excellence at the International Development Research Center. And she will dive deep into a key statistical system that can contribute to the monitoring of gender equality for women and girls. You can all guess, Civil Registration and Vital Statistics, CRVS. She will focus on the challenges faced in strengthening these systems around the world and what partners are needed for success. What kind of partnerships do we need for success? Last but certainly not least is our third speaker, Andy Tatum. Andy is the director and the co-founder at Wrapup project and FlowMinder. We are very excited to have him, and he will provide the big data angle to our discussions and share examples on how non-traditional data sources can also fill gaps. He will discuss the importance of connecting such research with policymakers at the country level to increase use and impact of new data. So with those brief introductions out of the way, let's just turn to our first speaker, Eleanor. Eleanor, working with Open Data Watch and Data2X, have recently published a report on bridging the gap. Could you please tell us a little bit about the major findings of this assessment and how we can take the information we have around gaps and translate them into sort of solutions and lessons that we can use for improving data for women and girls? Over to you, Eleanor, for about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shada. And I'm so delighted to kind of be kicking off today's session. So you set me up for the introduction so well. And so what I'm going to do today is just talk through some of the major findings of this new study that Shada introduced for us. And essentially, this is a wider project that Data2X and ODW are working on together. And we chose the name Bridging the Gap because we wanted not only to highlight and look at the landscape of gender data availability, but we really wanted to examine what types of workable solutions may be available in context where we're finding these data gaps. So you can see the link to the report on the first slide, and I'd really encourage everyone to download it and share it widely. So if I could just have the next slide. So taking a step back for a moment, we know that we lack information on women and girls' lives in so many different aspects. This project really aimed to answer two overarching questions. The first is, what would a data system that properly recognized and represented women and girls actually look like? That's the first question we're trying to answer. The second is, what do we need to do to get there, to create these data systems that are more representative? Next slide. Could I have the next slide? Great. So to answer these questions, we really narrowed our focus to sub-Saharan Africa. So we wanted to take a regional focus, and we chose 15 countries to assess the gender data landscape. We then assembled a list of 104 indicators, both those included within the SDG indicator list and those from other international lists, reasoning that full information on these indicators would allow us to monitor progress on at least some of the basic commitments that have been made to women and girls. So to understand where the existing data comes from, we looked in both international and national databases. We kind of dug deep into the sources of data by examining their metadata and recording microdata sources. So by that, we mean the specific surveys, censuses, administrative data sources used for calculating the indicators. So this allowed us to establish trends in data production, to learn from areas where some countries are doing well and assess whether success is replicable, and pinpoint really strategic opportunities to improve gender data collection for these indicators. Next slide. So understanding that data gaps come in many forms, we wanted to know a few different things. First, we wanted to know not only whether an indicator existed at all, but whether or not the indicator was disaggregated by sex and by other relevant disaggregations, for example, geographic location or income group. We also wanted to know if the data was being produced on a regular basis and how timely the data behind each indicator was. This we consider to be a key quality consideration and really has impact on how useful the information is to decision makers. Finally, we also wanted to know if countries and international agencies were adhering to standards on their indicator production. Next slide. So what you can see here are the 15 countries that we concentrated on within this report, and these countries represent 60% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, and of course a range of income levels within that. The 104 indicators that we selected include 68 gender-relevant SDG indicators and 36 non-SDG indicators from other international sources. One thing that it's worth noting is that what we covered in this study were Tier 1 and Tier 2 indicators, and we didn't explore kind of methodological advancements needed for Tier 3 indicator measurements. Next slide. So what did we find? Well, overall, while data exists for 52% of gender indicators at both national and international level, 48% lack sex disaggregation or are missing entirely. So the main message then is that for almost half of the indicators that we already know how to collect, countries are not producing estimates for women and men, boys and girls. We also looked at additional disaggregation beyond sex and found that only 44% of indicators are produced with complete disaggregation at the international level, and just 32% are produced with complete disaggregation at the national level. So clearly there is much work to be done in order to ensure that we're reaching the most vulnerable populations. Next slide. So the results that I just showed you on the previous slide represent availability of indicators across 6 different domains. And one thing that I think it's really illuminating to note is where the majority of indicators fall across these 6 domains. So we can see that we have high concentrations of indicators within health, economic opportunity, and education. And we could argue that these domains have benefited from statistical capacity building, both in the MDG era and now into the Sustainable Development Goal era, while other domains maybe haven't had as much focus from a gender perspective. Next slide. And we also looked over the period from 2010, allowing us to assess how often data is being produced. And as we can see from this graph, there was a spike in 2016 with relatively lower levels of production in other years. And I think this should really kind of pique our curiosity and our interest about whether up-to-date information is available for decision making and what's happening in the years that don't have high levels of data production. Next slide. So getting a sense of these larger trends from international and national databases is extremely helpful in outlining common challenges. But one thing we wanted to do was to dive more deeply into some of the micro data sources. And in order to do that, we concentrated just on the 68 SDG indicators within our entire list. And this can help us to pinpoint and work towards specific solutions. So, for example, we learned that a high proportion of gender-relevant SDG indicators are being produced from internationally sponsored surveys. So there's obviously an opportunity here to both leverage these data sources to fill gaps, but also an opportunity to diversify data sources to try to ease some of the pressure on some of these surveys and spread data generation more evenly across the data production system. We also found that administrative data like CRVS, which you're going to hear about in a moment, that this type of data is extremely important, but were often underreported, undocumented, and found to be less accessible than data produced by surveys. We also know and can start to see that there are opportunities for non-traditional data sources to play a role in providing gender-specific information for decision-making. And I'm excited to hear Andy's presentation later on about some of those issues. Next slide. So where do we go from here to build workable solutions? Essentially, we made a number of different recommendations across the data value chain that could help to fill gender data gaps. The first is to build towards more complete disaggregation, either through interacting data sources or making improvements to individual data sources. Frequency is also obviously a key issue, and we advise that all countries aim for frequent production of headline indicators and an even spread of data collection across regular intervals. This takes long-term planning and support from and coordinating among development partners who may be sponsoring data collection. Country capacity also will need to be strengthened, which in turn would also support compilation and dissemination of sex-disaggregated data where it already exists, but potentially hasn't been properly mined. Next slide. So we're turning our attention now to two main tasks. The first is building partnerships at the international, regional, and national levels to co-create solutions to the data gaps that we've identified. So on our side, we're preparing resources for countries to take action on gender data gaps. We're also creating a partnership with the UN Economic Commission for Africa to launch a network of individuals and professionals working in gender data in the region to encourage cross-country learning and sharing, as well as connect with opportunities to upskill and support from other agencies on particular topics. We're also exploring partnerships with international agencies to close gaps. But recognizing that there's more to do on coordination among custodian agencies and capacity building organization, this strand of work aims to ensure that countries can leverage their data collection instruments to provide high quality gender data in the most efficient and effective ways possible. And finally, we'll be repeating this exercise in other regions later this year, and we really look forward to sharing those results as they become available. So thank you so much. Shada, I'll hand back over to you and looking forward to questions.
Thank you, and thank you, Eleanor. This is an excellent presentation and wonderful slides. And it's so important that we start with sort of stating or going over an overview on the current state of gender data gaps. And it's encouraging to see that Data2X is really putting an emphasis on this and bringing different communities together. Tando, turning to you, and as we've seen also from from Eleanor's presentation, CRVS play a tremendously important role in providing a range of important data on women's and girls. However, many of the systems are, as we know, underperforming, under-resourced, underfunded, and so why is this important? And what insights can you offer for us in this context? Over to you, Tando. 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jaida. Definitely very excited and glad to be here. So I will talk a little bit more in detail about the specific part of the gender data ecosystem that we work on at the International Development Research Center, and that is Civil Registration and Vital Statistics Systems, or CRVS in short. And in answering sort of a question that Shaida posed, I really talk about three things. One is why CRVS systems matter for gender equality, and then what the gaps are, and I think way forward as to what needs to be done and what needs to happen to move towards closing the gender gaps. So what civil registration is really the recording of important events in a person's life. These include birth, death, marriage, and divorce. Everyone benefits from strong CRVS systems that record this information about births, marriages, divorces, and deaths. It empowers people with proof of age and legal identity, which really enables and facilitates access to critical public and social services, but also protecting individual human rights. And so this is critically important, especially for women and girls, for various reasons. For example, birth registration, having a birth certificate helps girls prove their age and seek social protection, and this can actually help prevent early and child forced marriage. And studies have shown strong links between high rates of birth registration and low rates of child marriage. Education is a basic human right and is essential for breaking the cycle of poverty. Every year that a girl spends in primary school increases her future wages by 10 to 20%. And yet not having a birth certificate or a proof of identity is a key reason why many girls are not able to attend school. When you look at marriage and death registration, they are effective tools for women's economic empowerment. They establish spousal rights. They give women legal protection in the event that their spouse dies. They can access and claim inheritance, benefits like pension, child support, alimony. So they are critical to protecting women's rights within marriage. Having a proof of age and legal identity is also critical to helping women gain financial independence, being able to open a bank account, apply for a loan, access credit, even being able to participate politically, register to vote requires having proof of identity. And so across the board, just civil registration, by empowering women and girls with proof of age and legal identity, really is critical to helping them access social services that they need. On the other side of the coin too, because of the information that CRVS systems collect, they provide real-time data that's disaggregated at the lowest level by sex, by geography, and other relevant characteristics that is critical to monitoring progress towards gender equality, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And so, for example, 6 to 7 indicators that cover 12 of 17 SDGs need data from CRVS systems to monitor them. And even for specific gender-related indicators, such as maternal mortality, infant mortality, access to education, social services, CRVS systems provide data that's critical to monitor how well are we doing towards meeting those targets. So for example, when deaths are registered with information on the causes of death, this is really critical to helping governments understand who is dying from what and where in real time. And having that information in real time enables effective planning for how to prevent premature deaths and mortality. And so what are the gaps? Across the board, CRVS systems are generally weak, especially in low and middle income countries, and don't produce enough data. There are very few countries in Africa, for example, south of the Sahara, that can produce vital statistics from civil registration on a regular basis. So much of the data that's published on birth and death registration is based on surveys like MIX and DHS or self-reported data that is helpful, but is often retroactive, can be unreliable, and often represents averages. And averages don't always tell the full story because they can miss the most vulnerable populations. When you look at it from a gender perspective, there's so many barriers that women and girls still face to accessing the benefits and protections of civil registration. And so, for example, in some countries, the birth of a child cannot be registered permanently without the signature of a father or a grandfather, and that immediately is a barrier for single mothers, for example. In some countries, marriage below the age of 18 is permitted, and there's at least 10 countries in Africa, south of the Sahara, where there is no legal obligation to register a marriage. And what this means is that there are no legal protections for women in those marriages, and no legal protections for children under the age of 18 who may be forced into early marriages. When you look at death registration, the picture is especially dismal. In Africa alone, for example, there's only about 5 countries that register at least 80% of deaths. And when you parse that out by sex, the deaths of women and girls tend to be massively underreported. And that is a catastrophic and a huge blind spot, because if women's deaths are not being registered, it means that we don't have real-time information on why women are dying, where, and what can be done to prevent those deaths. And so monitoring progress towards preventing maternal mortality and premature deaths becomes incredibly difficult without that real-time data. And so in sum, when CRVS systems don't fully count everyone, especially women and girls, it makes it really impossible and difficult to create policies and programs that can protect women and girls throughout their lives. And so what is needed, to close some of these critical gaps? And I think a couple of things. One is, I think, closer collaboration across the board, because CRVS systems are so critical, but they're inherently complex, and it needs partners, governments working together, rallying around country-defined priorities to strengthen CRVS systems. I think there's a need for more research to understand and uncover the complex factors, social, cultural, economic, political, that impact the use of civil registration and the quality of the data that we have. And so data on marriage registration, for example, is virtually non-existent. Why? And how can we better produce data to understand how women are being protected in these institutions? Customary marriages and traditional marriages tend to be not validated in the registrar's offices. Why is that happening? Women's deaths are being under-registered and under-reported. Why is that happening? So in other words, if women are not being counted, I think we need to get better at understanding and addressing the why. Why is this happening? And what do we know about the factors that influence it so that we can better prevent it? And then I think we need to get better as well at telling the story, because it's not enough to just produce the data. It's not enough to just have more and better disaggregated data. I think we need to get better at amplifying the utility of data, not just for policymakers, decision makers, but even the communities that produce the data themselves. And we at the Center of Excellence for CRVS Systems here at the International Development Research Center really continue together with our partners to keep gender in the CRVS agenda. We convene events around gender and CRVS. We publish knowledge products. We build the knowledge base. We support research on non-registration. So how does that affect vulnerable women and girls? What can be done to address low registration and what are the causes of non-registration in order to close the knowledge gaps, but also produce evidence, empirical evidence on what works and what can be done to better close those gaps. Because at the end of the day, I think really registering and counting women's vital events, their births, their deaths, their marriages, is critical to empowering them, to protecting them, to being able to provide for their needs. And I think there's so much more that needs to be done to close the gaps and to make every woman visible with strong CRVS systems. And lastly, just to say that most of what we do is in partnership, and I think that of course underscores the power of partnership, because when we come together around critical developments, needs and strengthening CRVS systems, we all can go much further together than we could individually. Thank you. And so with that, Shaida, I'll hand it over back to you and look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, and this was excellent. And I think it's tremendously important what you pointed to, that closing this sort of gaps through the CRVS has amazing potential, not only for closing the gaps in data, but of course closing the gaps in equality, in the visibility of women and girls, and improving the lives of everyone. You know, it's not only women and girls. When you make women equal and visible, and you improve lives overall. So thank you so much for bringing that out, and also what the Center of Excellence is doing in trying to improve CRVS systems around the world. Andy, we're now turning to you. There's a lot that we have talked about on what we call the more traditional data sources side of the discussions. And turning to you, how can big data and non-traditional data sources fit into these discussions around closing gender data gaps? And what are Wrapup and FlowMinders currently working on? What sort of partnerships you have found to be critical to ensure not only the success of the project, but sort of future use and impact of the data that you're generating? Over to you, Andy, for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to Eleanor and Thando for setting me up nicely with this. Firstly, I guess the question of what are big data and new forms of data. I think that there's a common perception of that kind of data being things from social media, from mobile phone data, but also it comes from satellite imagery. It comes from new forms of processing and interpreting traditional data sources. So the GPS locations of clusters in household surveys, digital censuses, and mapping individual buildings. And importantly, I think these big and new forms of data should not be seen as a replacement for traditional sources. They can complement them, but ideally we would like to have census data, CRVS data, the kind of data sources we've heard about already, collected and strengthened and improved everywhere. Then we may not need these newer forms of data to fill gaps. But in the current situation, we know that some forms of data are outdated, incomplete, and large area averages that hides a lot of heterogeneities. And it's here where the newer forms of data can help. There are great heterogeneities hidden by large area averages, and it's going to be it's a challenge to identify those groups, whether that's males, females, vulnerable groups who are missing from those data sets when we look at large area averages. And the slide on your screen now illustrates some of these challenges when we are looking, for instance, at the female literacy rate in Nigeria from demographic and health surveys data. We can see some variation there, but many of those units are larger than most countries in the world, and there's a lot of variation within there. If we think about skilled birth attendants there in Uganda from a survey, we see it's 74% of women have that skilled birth attendants, but there's a great variation we know that exists. If we're trying to get the basics of how many males and females there are in a country in different age groups, this kind of data exists, but as you can see from Afghanistan there, the last census was 1979, and all the official statistics are based on projections from that. And then if we're thinking about how populations are changing and moving, often that data is improving, but is often at national scales and not disaggregated by males and females. So in the group here in Southampton in the UK, in Wrapup, we focus on developing methods for trying to integrate different forms of geospatial data to improve and fill those gaps. And in the Flowminder Foundation, we focus on developing tools, connecting with end users, stakeholders, to try and get those research outputs better used. So we're trying to cover that full spectrum from data providers and scientists to those stakeholders and policy makers, and facilitate a two-way interaction. So listening to the needs and constraints of governments, UN agencies, but also showing them what is possible from the new forms of data for those end users that are often too busy and stretched to explore what's possible. So I'll go through just a few examples of how we can try and improve what I've shown on this slide here. So if we go to the next slide, hopefully we see if we aggregate together and bring together all the different forms of geospatial subnational data on an age and sex disaggregated data from household surveys, from census data, and match those to boundaries, and then integrate those with data from satellites on the location of settlements, all the factors that we know affect how populations distribute themselves in the landscape. We can produce these much more detailed and consistent data sets. In this case, this is a number of women of childbearing age across Africa, and each of those data sets are freely available and open to download. If we go to the next slide, we see how moving to those subnational scales really highlights some of the heterogeneities that we miss at those broad scales. So a very extreme example is Kuwait. If we look at the US Census Bureau data for 2010, we get a standard population pyramid. But when we look at some of those subnational regions, we see great variations in the structures between males and females, and between different years as well, with those trends growing. Huge amounts of migration and changes in the country. If we go to the next slide, we also see how we can fill in data gaps where there's been a problem in terms of collection of data. So the last census in 1979 in Afghanistan, on the top left there, you see that some data has been collected, but working with the government, we're able to integrate and use data sets from satellite data, from surveys on the ground, to build models to predict those population numbers in the unsampled areas and fill in those gaps. And these are now statistics that the government is using and that the UN agencies and the countries are adopting to move on from 1979 numbers and use those data to capture those vulnerable populations and make sure everybody is counted. We go to the next slide. We can also make use of standard household survey data at the cluster level. So although these are small sample sizes, here we're looking at female literacy. Again, there are strong statistical relationships with data that we can capture from satellites and from mobile phone data. So people at higher literacy rates tend to be within urban areas. They tend to be closer to major roads. They tend to use their phones more often, make greater rates of calls. And if we can use those relationships to then fill in those gaps and predict into those unsampled areas. And this is work that was done in collaboration with Eleanor's group at Data2X. We go to the next slide. We see similar approaches can be used in multi-temporal data sets. In this case, skilled birth attendants, antenatal care, and postnatal care. So moving on from those large area averages that we saw for Uganda at the start, that we can actually see there's improvements across the country, but those improvements are taking place in small areas and other areas are being left behind. So this enables a more refined targeting by bringing together these different data sets again. And the final slide, we can move on from the large area statistics on migration to bringing in, again, integration of census microdata, household survey data, satellite data to bring together models of subnational migration flows, and our ongoing work is disaggregating those by gender, as those flows can be incredibly different. So just to, hopefully I've shown that there are possibilities here for those new data sources to complement, but those partnerships in doing that are critical. I started my career as an academic and got frustrated with producing outputs that never made it into actually being used. And the problems are often that mobile operators, satellite providers are not talking to governments, they're not talking to household survey data teams. Equally, national statistics offices, ministries of health have a challenge in terms of capacity and the ability to change direction and act on new data sources. I think here, if we've shown that if these data sets can be brought together and there are ways to connect these very disparate communities often, that these data can be valuable when brought together, and there's a need in all cases here to engage end users in the full process, building and strengthening capacity along the way and tailoring those outputs and analysis to those end users if we're going to see them adopted. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. And can I please remind you to turn on your webcam. There is going to be a screen that asks you whether you want to turn on your webcam. So if you allow it, then everybody can see you. So thanks, Andy. This was amazing presentation and making a very strong case, as we see, for these new sources of data, from satellite data, mobile phone data, the new survey data, and how this data can actually connect and help with the official data monitoring. And also for connecting the data, we need to connect communities. That's tremendously important. So thanks, Andy. So I'm now going to turn it to Deirdre, and Deirdre is going to help us to kind of pull the audience and get some feedback from them on some of the questions that we have designed. Over to you, Deirdre.
Great, thank you, Shada, and thank you to all our speakers for your presentation. So now we'll be handing it over to you, our audience, and share with you 3 different series of questions on this topic. So we'll run through them one by one, and then at the end of each one, you will go back to the panel for some of their reactions and to hear what they think about these questions. So in a moment, you should be seeing the first question on your screen. Question 1, has the focus on the need for better data to measure and monitor the Sustainable Development Goals improved the quality and use of gender data? Select one of the following. Yes, gender data has improved. No, I have not seen any difference. Or I don't know. Please take a moment to select one of the following. Okay, so here are the results. About half of the folks online think that gender data has improved with the data revolution that's come alongside the Sustainable Development Goals. 17% have not seen a difference, and this might be interesting to tease out later on why this might be the case despite this consensus around the need for data to measure and monitor the 17 goals. And 35% just don't know, and that also might be a great point for further insights on why might that be the case. So let's move ahead to question 2. Question 2, which stage along the data value chain poses the greatest challenges for your organization in efforts to close gender data gaps? And the data value chain refers back to the visual, if you might remember, in Eleanor's presentation that showed the path data travels from its collection all the way down to its use and impact. So please select one of the following: collection, publication, uptake, impact. We'll give a few moments for everyone to think about this one and answer. Okay, so it looks like 50% are saying that the collection stage, is the most difficult in terms of efforts to close gender data gaps. Publication is the second most challenging. Uptake, meaning how do we ensure it gets into the hands of those who can use it, is 9%, and impact, ensuring that data is doing what I think all of us are here for, to improve outcomes and improve lives, is 18%. Moving ahead to question 3. Question 3. While all have an important role to play, what group should be further brought into discussions around closing gender data gaps? And while, again, as the question states, everyone has a role to play in this, we ask that you only select one of the following. So non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, government ministries, national statistical offices, or private sector. Please take a moment to answer this one. Okay, so the results for which stakeholder group should be more active in conversations or be brought further into discussions around closing gender data gaps. National statistical offices take the lead, followed by government ministries, and next non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and last academic institutions. So that concludes our interactive audience poll section. I think I will hand it back to Shada to discuss with our panelists the results. Some interesting points were why gender data hasn't necessarily received the attention alongside the data revolution for the SDGs, perhaps some points around why collection poses the greatest challenges to closing gender data gaps, and also what I was surprised by, why private sector isn't necessarily a stakeholder group that might need to be brought further into these discussions, and why national statistical offices might be the main candidate right now. So over to you, Shada, and our panelists.
Thank you. Thanks, Deirdre. Very interesting results, and actually surprised me. So that means we have a very diverse group and perspectives that we're really interesting to hear here. So thanks a lot. So let me go back to you, our three speakers, and get some feedback from you on anything that surprised you with the result from the polling of the audience, and any perspective that you can offer. Maybe we take 1 minute per speaker, and then we go back to the question and answer section. Eleanor, shall we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Shada. And thanks everyone for participating. Those are really interesting results to see. Particularly, I was interested that, around half of our participants said that gender data had improved. And I think, my perspective on it would be that certainly looking over the last, let's say, 10 years or so, that gender data certainly has improved. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals have been a big part of helping to expand our horizon slightly in terms of what our expectations are for gender data. But completely agree that there's much more to do, both on closing gender data gaps and And I think on pinpointing exactly what those gaps are and mapping out the road ahead on how we close them. In terms of the data value chain question, I think it's very clear results there that we are still focused on sort of upstream production issues, and that's very much has been a focus of Data2X over the past years. One thing I would be kind of interested for us to think about, though, is that would these proportions change considerably if those upstream issues were resolved? Would we then start to see all of the downstream issues in terms of capacity around data analytics and actually using data and turning it into insights for decision making? I think there's an unexplored area there in how to actually get all the way down the value chain into impact. In terms of groups to bring in, I think it's clear that national statistical offices will be the pinnacle of national statistical systems around which data collection will always revolve. I think it's also heartening to see that everyone agrees that government ministries need to be key partners in the gender data fight in terms of both production and use. I think I would argue a little bit for our friends in academic institutions and non-governmental organizations, as well as other civil society groups and media. Really, you know, in order to make headway, we need to look at different types of partnerships with different types of partners and what each of those partnerships might be able to achieve. So those are just some initial reactions, but interested to hear what others have to say as well.
Thanks, Eleanor. Over to you, Thando. What do you think, and what's surprised you?
No, I think I'm very interested in results, and I agree with Eleanor. I was struck by the feedback on what we think about whether gender data has improved or not, and I think it's interesting that sort of there's split halfway a little bit, you know, because I think gender data is having a moment right now. I think the SDGs have sort of shined a necessary spotlight on the importance of gender data and its power to drive positive change, and I think part of the hesitation around, yes, it has improved, but half of us think it hasn't, around about half. And I think that's recognizing that momentum is fantastic and it's great. But I really hope, and I think all of us do, that this will not just be a moment in time where we're talking gender data, but that it's a sustained commitment to really unpacking people's differentiated experiences, understanding why it makes a difference and using it to make a difference. In other words, I think I hope that the momentum continues to lead to action, to actually improve data, and that it moves beyond just being a moment in time. And I think on the NSOs, I was really struck by that, obviously because we work in CRVS systems. But I think it goes back to Andy's point and yours, Shaida, about I think the importance of connecting data communities, right? Because I think we recognize that, yes, national statistical offices are the custodians, and in most cases, but I think especially with where we are when national systems are often not as strong enough as they should be, I think there's just so much more that needs to be done to bridge those gaps between actors, including the private sector as well, actually, because they actually have and collect so much data. And so I think there's important work to be done to bridge communities and to partner in innovative ways and figuring out how can we work together to further this agenda. I think there's a common goal here, and that's counting women and girls and accounting for gender diverse persons, as well as accounting for gender differences. And I think that goal should drive more innovative partnerships across the board.
Thanks, Thando. Over to you, Andy, for your perspective. We can't hear you, Andy. Are you muted?
Yes, there we go. I guess I'll focus on the final question, which I guess it's maybe an unfair question in that I think always the government and NSOs are going to be the primary groups to bring in. They have the remit to produce those official statistics and and are looked up to produce those. But I think there's, as Stando says, there's a need to bring much more closely those other types of groups. If we look at some of the most advanced national statistics offices in the world, so the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, they're all building much stronger links to the private sector, where often mobile companies, for instance, have better and more up-to-date data on where people are and their characteristics than national statistics offices. Those data are sitting and often are not used. We see great partnerships being built up between satellite companies and national statistics offices for planning censuses, for identifying and improving and making more efficient those operations. So I think that's the outcome of that question is the right one. But bringing everybody in more closely is going to be the way to go.
Thanks, Andy. So we're getting close to the end of the hour, and it looks like gender data needed actually more than 1 hour webinar. But I just wanted to make sure we at least answer 1 or 2 quick questions from the audience. Deirdre, can you choose 1 or 2 questions for our speakers with the very flash responses from them?
Sure,
Deirdre?
I'll do my best to comb through. We've had several of them, but so there you go. You should be able to see me now. So one question we have, I think this could be for anyone, and then we have a specific one for Andy. The first is, and I'll read both out before going back to the panel. Regarding the timeliness of gender data, do guidelines exist for how frequently certain data sets should be published? And perhaps taken another way, how do we combat this issue that Eleanor had raised around timeliness of gender data, especially if we're hoping for use of policy making? The second question directed to Andy is Wrapup working on geospatial data products which show gender-specific population distributions? If yes, then how is it handling data quality issues? So over to you.
Yes. Thanks, Deirdre. Since we have very short time, Andy, do you think you can do a 1-minute answer, and then maybe all the other questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, we'll go back to the experts and we get a response and share them through emails. So 1 minute for each of you. Andy?
Yeah, I'll answer the question. Yes, we're producing gender disaggregated geospatial data sets. On the population counts, of course, there's a lot of problems in terms of the kind of thing of age heaping and groups like females being missed in some of these. And we're applying various modeling techniques to identify those gaps and fill them in. And then in terms of the modeling based on household survey data, we're always measuring the uncertainty and the error in those data and communicating and presenting uncertainty outputs, so that it's not just a single map with our best guess, but it's also here's our best guess and here's our confidence intervals around it.
Thanks, Andy. Back to you, Tando. Anything you want to add or any closing remarks? Tando?
Thanks, Shana. I think I would just quickly jump in here to say that I think on timeliness, it goes back to the data value chain, but also I think talking a bit more about those issues of use and impact. And again, building the bridge between where data is actually produced and connecting it to those who actually need to use it on a regular basis. I think there's a lot to be done there. Progress is being made, but definitely much more to be done.
Eleanor?
Thanks. Yeah, just on the timeliness, I would say that this is really a crucial issue and requires us to think about the entire data collection system and all of the different data collection instruments at the disposal of a country, and trying to really think about how often and how much detail each of them needs to produce what information. So it's a huge coordination challenge, but one that we're keen to be involved in and partner on.
Thank you, and thanks to our excellent speakers. Sorry we ran out of time for more discussions and more questions, but as Deirdre said, we would really love to hear more feedback from you, and you can visit us on the website that we've shared with you, and we will be, of course, sharing the recording of this webinar, and I hope you stay tuned for webinar number 4 in April, which is going to be on financing for development data and for SDGs. And please join me to thank our excellent speakers and for shedding lights on gender data, and also talking not only about the importance of the data, but also some of the opportunities and challenges and solutions with a focus on how we can build partnership and connect data communities. So thanks again for being our wonderful audience and our speakers, and have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are, and take care. Bye-bye.